Hello, everyone. This is George Weigel. I'm speaking to you from the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, and I'm very happy to be part of this virtual Cardinal O'Connor Conference on Life. Very sorry we can't be together at Georgetown University, but happy to be with you in this way. This virtual conference is being held the day after the annual March for Life in Washington, the 49th annual March for Life. And this year's March for Life is going to be different. It's going to be different because it will be a march into what we can reasonably hope is a quite different future. And that is because the Supreme Court in June of this year, we expect, late June, will hand down its decision in the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Center in Mississippi. This Dobbs case is the best opportunity that the court has had to reverse the mistakes the Supreme Court made in 1973 in the Roe versus Wade case, a mistake the court then reaffirmed in an even more bizarre way in the 1992 case of Casey versus Planned Parenthood of southeastern Pennsylvania. If the court does its constitutional duty, and there is every reason to expect that that will be the case this time, if the court does its constitutional duty in the Dobbs case, Roe and Casey will be consigned to the dustbin of history, where we find the 1857 case of Dred Scott versus Sanford and the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson, two of the most wretched decisions in Supreme Court history. Dred Scott, in which the court claimed that Americans of African descent had no rights that white Americans were bound to respect. Plessy versus Ferguson, which upheld the constitutionality of segregated public facilities. After the Dobbs case is handed down, we have every reason to expect that Roe and Casey will join Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson in the dustbin of history. And it will be stated, it will be clear that there is no right to abortion, so-called, to be found in the United States Constitution. What will this mean? What will it mean if the court, in fact, does what it ought to do and what I expect it to do in the Dobbs case, and that is effectively reverse Roe and Casey? What will that mean? Well, it'll mean three things. First of all, it will mean a far more complex abortion debate, pro-life debate, in the United States. The first 49 marches for life, including this year's in 2022, have been primarily focused on the bogus so-called right to abortion declared in Roe, created ex nihilo, really out of constitutional thin air, in Roe versus Wade, and then reaffirmed in 1992 in Casey. If the court does what I and others expect it to do in the Dobbs case, then there will be 51 debates in the United States and not just one national debate over abortion. Some of those 51 debates in the 50 states and here in the District of Columbia, we will win. And there will be put into place later this year or next protective laws similar to the fetal heartbeat law now in place in the state of Texas. Some of those debates we will lose. It is quite possible, indeed virtually certain, that in the months after Dobbs consigns Roe and Casey to the dustbin of history, that states like Washington, Oregon, California, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, unfortunately my state of Maryland, will put Roe-like abortion legal regimes into place through state legislation. And then there will be 20, perhaps 20 or 25, hotly contested state debates over legal protection for the unborn. Those 25 hotly contested debates are going to test our movement. They're going to be a test of political strategy. They will also be a test of the virtue of prudence. When we cannot achieve all that we would want to achieve in those 25 hotly contested states, how do we achieve what we can achieve without conceding on principle? This is going to be a real test of the prudential judgment of the pro-life movement. It's going to be a real test of our capacity for carefully crafted legislative strategies. It's going to be a real test of our capacity to maintain rational, morally serious arguments in the increasingly crazy, febrile world of the internet and social media. It's also going to be a test of our capacity to change the language game of these debates. Note that when I was speaking about our opportunities, I talked about our capacity post-Dobbs to put into place protective laws. For 50 years now, the media and our opponents have talked about restrictive laws. We need to change that language game. We need to get the word protective into play, especially in these hotly contested state debates. Moreover, rather than talking about restrictive laws, we talk about protective laws. We need to flip the language on the other side and challenge the notion of liberal laws with the language of permissive laws. So the debate going forward, we need to frame as one between protective versus permissive, and begin to change people's minds through that change of language. The second thing that a post-Roe America, the second challenge that a post-Roe America will put before our movement is a challenge to ramp up alternatives to abortion in crisis pregnancies and knowledge of those alternatives. Because the knowledge that there are alternatives to abortion for women caught in the dilemma of unplanned or unwanted pregnancy, that knowledge is itself part of making more available the alternatives that exist. There are some 3,000 crisis pregnancy centers in the United States today. We need to make them better known. We need to make this humane, loving, compassionate, caring alternative to the technological quick fix, so imagined, of abortion better known. It has always been the case. It's always been the case that no one in the United States has to have an abortion. That's always been the case. That's always been the truth. And now we need to make that ever more clear, and that at the same time, we must make ever more clear that through these crisis pregnancy centers and other available alternatives, that we in the pro-life movement care just as much about and are prepared to support effectively mothers and their children after delivery when we are supporting those women and their unborn children before delivery. The big lie, one of the big lies that will be in play in the 50 state arguments and the argument here in the District of Columbia after the Dobbs case, is that the pro-life movement only cares about unborn children. That is simply a lie, and the best way to counter that lie is to demonstrate, as we have done for these 5 decades, that we not only care, but we provide effective support and service to women and their born children, as we do to women during crisis pregnancies. The third thing that a post-Roe America is going to require of us is a renewed commitment to changing the culture, indeed to converting the culture. Last month, December of last year, December 2021, I happened to be teaching at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum, in Rome, and in one of my lectures, I explained how St. John Paul II's 1995 encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, in which Cardinal O'Connor, in whose honor this conference is named, played a significant role in the drafting of that document. I explained how Evangelium Vitae was an extension of the social doctrine of John Paul II, and how in Evangelium Vitae, the Pope, as I explained at the last Cardinal O'Connor conference I was able to address in person, how the Pope warned that democracies that declare wrongs to be rights, like the willful taking of innocent human life, when that becomes declared a right, when that grave moral wrong becomes legally instantiated as a right, those democracies are in deep trouble. And in the course of trying to illustrate that point, I mentioned an extraordinary movie from 1961 called Judgment at Nuremberg. And I asked my students, who were from all over the world, Poland, Ireland, Eritrea, the Philippines, Pakistan, you name it. I asked them if they had ever seen Judgment in Nuremberg. Well, not only had they not seen it, they hadn't heard of it. Well, that's a shame, and I urged them all to find a way to watch it. And I've recently rewatched that film myself. It's an extraordinary piece of filmmaking, a spectacular cast. Spencer Tracy, Burt Lancaster, Judy Garland, Marlene Dietrich, Richard Widmark, Maximilian Schell won the Academy Award for Best Actor for that film. And it's perhaps one of the most important cinematic reflections on the awfulness, the horrors, the unspeakable wickedness that was afoot in Nazi Germany, asking the question, how could this happen? How could a civilized country do the things that happened in Nazi Germany? And beneath the exploration of those horrors and the legal and political dilemmas of passing judgment on those who were responsible in one fashion or another for those horrors, if not directly, then in terms of facilitating them at 1, 2, or 3 removes, it becomes clear, or it should become clear, that the old cliche, ideas have consequences, is really true, and that bad ideas can have lethal consequences. The film Judgment at Nuremberg doesn't get into this, but beneath the script is the fact that in the 1920s, very distinguished German legal and medical scholars created the notion, the idea, of what they called, in that classic German capacity to string words together into very long words, Lebens unwertes Leben. Lebens unwertes Leben. Life unworthy of life. And then made a legal case that the state had the right to take Lebens unwertes Leben, life unworthy of life. The immediate consequence of this, as the film makes painfully clear, was the sterilization of what were known as, quote, mental defectives, people with less than normal adult intelligence. Once you open that door, the next door is the sterilization of people who have the wrong political ideas, or the sterilization of people who have the wrong racial or ethnic background, and then the door is wide open to what became the mass slaughters of the Holocaust of European Jewry, the slaughters of homosexuals, gypsies, and all the rest in the extermination camps built by the Third Reich. Now, it's imprudent, dangerously imprudent, to imagine that ideas like Lebens unwertes Leben, life unworthy of life, could not take hold in the United States. It's imprudent to assume that because, in fact, they did once upon a time. As the film painfully reminds us, in a notorious Supreme Court decision in the case of Buck versus Bell, which involved a Virginia law not only permitting but requiring the sterilization of so-called mental defectives. Noteworthy, indeed some would regard him as great, American jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in his Supreme Court decision in Buck versus Bell, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, therefore the sterilization of the cognitively incompetent or less than competent is constitutionally permitted. That notion of life unworthy of life is more subtle in our culture today. After the revelation of the horrors of the Third Reich, it's very difficult for people to talk in eugenic terms in public policy today. But that notion that there are some lives that are of less value than other lives is present among us. It is now reinforced by false notions of freedom as choice, a concept of freedom that never asks us to complete the sentence and talk about what are we choosing. The notion of lives less worthy than other lives is reinforced by distorted notions of feminism. Some of those notions have just been very powerfully critiqued and an alternative feminism offered by my former student, friend, and Ethics and Public Policy Center colleague, Erica Bakioki, in her new book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, which I commend to all of you. I mention all of this because the key to a post-Roe America, in which every unborn child is cherished in life and protected in law, requires conversion of our culture, requires a conversion of hearts and minds. And so while we can look forward in June with some good reason to a major victory for the culture of life in the Supreme Court's impending Dobbs decision, we must also recognize that there will be marches for life in the future. There'll be a 50th March for Life in January 2023, and I hope there will be many more Cardinal O'Connor conferences on life in the future. I thank the organizers of this year's conference for their stalwart work, and I hope to see many of you at Georgetown in person in January 2023 as we march into a different future, hopefully a post-Roe America in which our work will be more complex, more challenging, but just as satisfying as we work together to build the culture of life. Thank you.